Welcome to CKLA Grade 5, Domain 1, Lesson 13. Today we're doing Point of View, Part 2. Our objectives for today, we're going to quote from the text and explaining the author's point of view. Some key vocabulary we're going to learn today. Crewmates are members of a group who work together on a ship, aircraft, or spacecraft. Vice grips are tools used to hold things firmly in place. Orbiter, part of the space shuttle that carries the crew. Houston, the control center of the NASA space flight located in Houston, Texas. And Charades is a game in which players act out a word or phrase without speaking. So before we get into the text, we're going to review what is point of view. Remember, point of view is the author's opinion about a subject. So it's how they're perceiving a subject. So as we read through this text, we're going to read through a view of the Earth again. We're going to go a little bit farther in it, and we're going to look for the author's point of view. A View of the Earth by Michael Massimino. In 1984, I was a senior in college, and I went to see the movie The Right Stuff. And a couple of things really struck me in that movie. The first was the view out the window of John Glenn's spaceship, the view of the Earth. How beautiful it was on the big screen. I wanted to see that view. And secondly, the camaraderie between the original 7 astronauts depicted in that movie, how they were good friends, how they stuck up for each other, how they never let each other down. I wanted to be a part of an organization like that. And it rekindled a boyhood dream that had gone dormant over the years. That dream was to grow up to be an astronaut, and I just could not ignore this dream. I had to pursue it, so I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, and I was lucky enough to get accepted to MIT. While I was at MIT, I started applying to NASA to become an astronaut. I filled out my application, and I received a letter that said they weren't quite interested. So I waited a couple of years, and I sent in another application. They sent me back pretty much the same letter. So I applied a third time, and this time I got an interview, so they got to know who I was, and then they told me no. So I applied a fourth time, and on April 22nd, 1996, I knew the call was coming, good or bad. I picked up the phone, and it was Dave Leestma, the head of flight crew operations at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. He said, "Hey Mike, this is Dave Leestma. How you doing this morning?" And I said, "I don't really know, Dave. You're going to have to tell me." And he said, "Well, I think you're going to be pretty good after this phone call because we want to make you an astronaut." 13 years after that, it's May 17th, 2009, and I'm on Space Shuttle Atlantis, about to go out and do a spacewalk on the Hubble Space Telescope. And our task that day was to repair an instrument that had failed. This instrument was used by scientists to detect the atmospheres of far-off planets. Planets and other solar systems could be analyzed using this spectrograph to see if we might find a planet that was Earth-like or a planet that could support life. And just when they got good at doing this, the power supply on this instrument failed. It blew. So the instrument could no longer be used. And there was no way really to replace this unit or to repair the instrument, because when they launched this thing, they got it ready for spaceflight. They really buttoned it up. They didn't want anybody to screw with this thing. It was buttoned up with an access panel that blocked the power supply that had failed. This access panel had 117 small screws with washers, and to play it safe, they put glue on the screw threads so that they could never come apart. You know, it could withstand a space launch, and there was no way we could get in to fix this thing. But we really wanted the Hubble's capabilities back, so we started working. And for 5 years, we designed a spacewalk. We designed over 100 new space tools to be used at great taxpayers' expense. Millions of dollars, thousands of people worked on this. And my buddy Mike Good, who we call Bueno, he and I were going to do this, to go out to do this spacewalk. I was going to be the guy actually doing the repair. And inside was Drew Fustel, one of my best friends. He was going to read me the checklist, and we had practiced for years and years for this. They built us our own practice instrument and gave us our own set of tools so we could practice in our office, in our free time, during lunch, after work, on the weekends. We became like one mind. He would say it, I would do it. We had our own language, and now was the day to go out and do this task. The thing I was most worried about when leaving the airlock that day was my path to get to the telescope, because it was along the side of the space shuttle. And if you look over the edge of the shuttle, it's like looking over a cliff, with 350 miles to go down to the planet, and there are no good handrails. When we're spacewalking, we like to grab onto things with our space gloves and be nice and steady, but I got to this one area along the side of the shuttle, and there was nothing good to grab. I had to grab a wire or a hose or a knob or a screw, and I'm kind of a big goon. When there's no gravity, you can get a lot of momentum built up, and I could go spinning off into space. I knew I had a safety tether that would probably hold, but I also had a heart that I wasn't so sure about. I knew they would get me back. I just wasn't sure what they would get me back on the end of the tether when they reeled me in. So I was really concerned about this. I took my time, and I got through the treacherous path and out to the telescope. The first thing I had to do was to remove the handrail from the telescope that was blocking the access panel. There were 2 screws on the top, and they came off easily. And there was 1 screw on the bottom right, and that came out easily. The 4th screw is not moving. My tool is moving, but the screw is not. I look close, and it's stripped. And I realize that handrail is not coming off, which means I can't get to the access panel with these 117 screws that I've been worrying about for 5 years, which means I can't get to the power supply that failed, which means we're not going to be able to fix this instrument today, which means all of these smart scientists can't find life on other planets. And I'm to blame for this. And I could see what they were saying in the science books in the future. This was going to be my legacy. My children and my grandchildren would read in their classrooms. We would know if there were life on other planets, but Gabby and Daniel's dad, my children would suffer for this. Gabby and Daniel's dad broke the Hubble Space Telescope, and we'll never know. And through this nightmare that had just begun, I looked at my buddy Bueno next to me in his space suit, and he was there to assist in the repair, but could not take over my role. He had his own responsibilities, and I was the one trained to do the now broken part of the repair. It was my job to fix this thing. I turned and looked into the cabin where my 5 crewmates were, and I realized nobody in there had a spacesuit on. They couldn't come out here and help me. And then I actually looked at the Earth. I looked at our planet, and I thought, there are billions of people down there, and there's no way I'm going to go home, get a house call on this one. No one can help me. I felt this deep loneliness, and it wasn't just a Saturday afternoon with a book alone. I felt detached from the Earth. I felt that I was by myself, and everything I knew and loved and that made me feel comfortable was far away. And then it started getting dark and cold. Because we travel 17,500 miles an hour, 90 minutes is 1 lap around the Earth. So it's 45 minutes of sunlight and 45 minutes of darkness. And when you enter the darkness, it's not just darkness. It's darkest black I've ever experienced. It's the complete absence of light. It gets cold, and I could feel that coldness, and I could sense the darkness coming, and it just added to my loneliness. For the next hour or so, we tried all kinds of things. I was going up and down the space shuttle, trying to figure out where I needed to go to get to the next tool to try to fix this problem, and nothing was working. And then they called up after about an hour and 15 minutes of this and said they wanted me to go to the front of the shuttle toolbox and get vice grips and tape. I thought to myself, we are running out of ideas. I didn't know we had tape on board. I'm going to be the first astronaut to use tape in space during a spacewalk. But I followed the directions. I got to the front of the space shuttle, and I opened up the toolbox, and there was the tape. At that point, I was very close to the front of the orbiter, right by the cabin window, and I knew that my best pal was in there trying to help me out, and I could not even stand to think of looking at him because I felt so bad about the way this day was going with all the work he and I had put in. But through the corner of my eye, through the helmet, but just the side there, I can kind of see that he's trying to get my attention. And I look up at him, and he's just cracking up, smiling, and giving me the okay sign. And I'm like, is there another spacewalk going on out here? I really can't talk to him because if I say anything, the ground will hear. Houston, the control center. So I'm kind of like playing charades with him. I'm like, what, are you nuts? And I didn't want to look before because I thought he was going to give me the finger because he's going down in the history books with me. But he's saying, no, we're okay. You just hang in there a little bit longer. We're going to make it through this. We're in this together. You're doing great. Just hang in there. And if there was ever a time in my life that I needed a friend, it was at that moment. And there was my buddy. Just like I saw in the movie, the camaraderie of those guys sticking together. I didn't believe him at all. I figured that we were out of luck. But I thought, at least if I'm going down with my best pal. As I turned to make my way back over the treacherous path one more time, Houston called up and told us what they had in mind. They wanted me to use the tape to tape the bottom of the handrail, and then they could see if I could yank it off the telescope. They said it was going to take about 60 pounds of force for me to do that. And Drew answers the call. He says, 60 pounds of force? He goes, Mass, I think you got that in you. What do you think? And I'm like, you bet, Drew. Let's go get this thing. I get back to this telescope and I put my hand on that handrail and the ground calls again and they go, well, Drew, you guys are okay to do this, but right now we don't have any downlink from the Mike's helmet camera. I've got these cameras mounted on my helmet so they can see everything I'm doing. It's kind of like your mom looking over your shoulder when you're doing your homework, And they go, we don't have any downlink for about another 3 minutes, but we know you're running late on time here, so if you have to, and I'm thinking, let's do it now while they can't watch, because the reason I'm taping this thing is if debris gets loose. They're gonna get all worried. It's gonna be another hour, and we'll never fix this thing. We've been through enough already. So I'm like, let's do it now while Mom and Dad aren't home. Let's have the party. So I say, Drew, I think we should go do it now. And Drew's like, go, and bam, that thing comes right off. I pull out my power tool, and I now have access to the panel with the 117 little bitty screws with their washers and glue, and I'm ready to get each of them. And I pull the trigger on the power tool, and nothing happens. And I think, I see the battery is dead. And I turn my head to look at Bueno, who's in a spacesuit, again, looking at me like, what else can happen today? And I said, Drew, the battery's dead in this thing, and I'm going to go back to the airlock, and we're going to swap out the battery, and I'm going to recharge my oxygen chain, because I was getting low on oxygen. I needed to refill. And he said, go. And I was going to back over that shuttle, and I noticed two things. One was that treacherous path that I was so scaredy cat sissy pants about going over. It wasn't scary anymore. That in the course of a couple of hours of fighting this problem, I had gone up and down the thing about 20 times. And my fear had gone away because there was no time to be scaredy cat. It was time to get the job done, and what we were doing was more important than me being worried. And it was actually kind of fun going across the little jungle gym back and forth over the shuttle. The other thing I noticed was that I could feel the warmth of the sun. We were about to come into the day pass, and the light in space, when you're in sunlight, is the brightest, whitest, purest light I've ever experienced, and it brings it with it warmth. I could feel that coming, and I actually started to feel optimistic. Sure enough, the rest of the spacewalk went well. We got all those screws out, a new power supply in, buttoned it up, and they tried. So that's actually where we're ending for the reading. So what's the difference between the author's point of view at the beginning of the text versus the end of the text? Well, in the beginning of the text, he really is yearning for this experience of being in space, but towards the end or the second passage, which towards the end, he starts to feel kind of lonely and sad, and then he kind of gets back up when he realizes things are kind of going optimistically. So you can see how his point of view of space has kind of changed. It was like this idealistic moment before he could be in space, but afterwards it became this just thing that he's been doing. And then towards the end, when he gets that optimism back, he starts looking at light and talks about that darkness. How is this difference reflected in the author's language? Well, at the beginning he says, the view of the earth, how beautiful it was. And then towards that other end, he's like, well, no one can help me. I feel lonely. I feel dark. It's cold. It's really important to understand that an author's point of view can change throughout a story depending on how they perceive a topic. So at the beginning, he seemed very excited about it. Then there's that kind of lull point, and then there's back to that optimism. So understand that your point of view can change in a story. So your job for the rest of this lesson is to complete your surprise, or continue working on your surprise narratives, and be sure to send those to your teacher. You can continue working on the one you're working on, or you can start a new one. However you'd like to do it, just make sure you are sending that to your teacher. And we'll see everyone in the next video.